A ruthless biker gang leader slapped a 76-year-old widow across the face, knocking her to the ground in front of everyone. The entire diner went silent. He stood over her, laughing, his leather-clad crew circling like wolves. He thought his reputation made him untouchable. He thought fear was his shield. But he made one catastrophic mistake. He didn't know the quiet man sitting alone in the corner booth, the one who'd been calmly eating his breakfast with his massive German shepherd resting at his feet, was her son. And he wasn't just any son, he was Delta Force. The biker had just signed his own death warrant, and he was about to learn why you never, ever touch a Delta operator's mother. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The morning air in cold water. Montana carried the kind of crisp, clean bite that only exists in small mountain towns far from the noise of the modern world. It was early autumn, and the aspens on the hillsides had turned to gold, their leaves shimmering in the sunlight, like coins scattered across a green velvet cloth. Main Street was quiet, just the way the locals liked it. A handful of pickup trucks parked at angles in front of the hardware store. An old man sweeping the sidewalk outside the barber shop. The faint smell of diesel and pine and fresh-baked bread drifting from the cornerstone diner. This was a town where everyone knew everyone, where doors were left unlocked, where a handshake still meant something. It was the kind of place people came to escape the chaos, to find peace. And for the past 3 years, that peace had belonged to Eleanor Hayes. She was 76 years old, a small woman with soft white hair always pinned in a neat bun, and eyes the color of faded denim that had seen a lifetime of love and loss. Her husband, Robert, had been a Marine. He'd passed 5 years ago, and since then, Eleanor had lived alone in the little house on Maple Street, the one with the blue shutters and the rose garden out front. But she was never really alone. Her son, Ethan, called every week, sent letters, visited when he could. But his visits were rare. His work, she understood, didn't allow for much freedom. She didn't ask questions. She knew better. All she knew was that her boy served his country, and that was enough. The Cornerstone Diner sat on the corner of Main and Fifth, like it had been there since the beginning of time itself. And in a way, it had. Built in 1952 by a man named Charlie Morton, who'd come back from Korea with shrapnel in his leg and dreams of something simple, something honest. The building was red brick, weathered but solid, with big plate glass windows that caught the morning sun and threw it back in golden sheets. A neon sign above the door flickered the word "Open" in cursive letters that had been buzzing the same electric hum for 40 years. Inside, the diner was a time capsule. Checkerboard floors, red vinyl booths with duct tape patches over the worn spots, a long formica counter with chrome-trimmed stools that spun if you kicked your feet just right. The walls were covered in framed photographs, black and white memories of Cold War's history, the founding families, the old lumber mill, the 4th of July parade from 1963, high school football teams, weddings, funerals, births. This diner wasn't just a place to eat. It was the living, breathing heart of the town. And every morning, without fail, Eleanor Hayes walked through that door at exactly 6:30. She'd worked at the Cornerstone for 3 years now. Not because she needed the money, though the extra income helped with the bills Robert had left behind. No, she worked because she needed the people, the routine, the purpose. After Robert died, the house had become too quiet, too full of ghosts, too full of memories that whispered in empty rooms. So when Maggie Delacroix, the diner's owner, had mentioned she needed help during the breakfast rush, Eleanor had tied on an apron the very next morning. Maggie was a force of nature. 62 years old, with salt and pepper hair she kept in a loose bun, strong arms from decades of flipping pancakes, and a laugh that could fill a room and chase away any darkness. She'd inherited the diner from her father, Charlie's nephew, and she ran it with the same no-nonsense warmth that had made it a fixture in Coldwater for generations. She took one look at Eleanor that first morning, saw the loneliness behind the smile, and hired her on the spot. "You don't have to be fast, honey," Maggie had said, tying the apron strings behind Eleanor's back like she was dressing a child for school. "You just have to be kind, and Lord knows you've got kindness to spare." And Eleanor did. She remembered everyone's name, knew how old Hank Mercer liked his eggs, scrambled, dry, with a side of rye toast, no butter, knew that Sally Brennan always ordered decaf, but secretly wanted the real stuff. So Eleanor would give her half and half and never say a word. Knew that Tommy Chen, who ran the hardware store, was diabetic, so she'd bring him sugar-free syrup without him having to ask. The regulars loved her. They called her Miss Eleanor, sometimes Ellie if they'd known her long enough. They asked about her garden, complimented her rose bushes, brought her cuttings from their own yards. When her kitchen sink had started leaking last spring, 3 men from the diner had shown up at her door with toolboxes before she'd even had a chance to call a plumber. This morning was no different. Eleanor pushed through the door at 6:30 sharp, the little bell above the frame chiming her arrival. The smell hit her immediately. Coffee, bacon, the yeasty warmth of fresh biscuits rising in the oven. It was the smell of comfort, of home. "Morning, Ellie," Maggie called from behind the grill, her spatula already dancing across the hot surface, flipping hash browns with the precision of a symphony conductor. "Morning, Maggie," Eleanor replied, hanging her coat on the rack by the door and reaching for her apron. It was pale blue with white piping, a little faded from too many washes, but clean and pressed. She tied it around her waist, the muscle memory of the motion as natural as breathing now. The diner was already half full. Hank Mercer sat at his usual spot at the counter, his weathered hands wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee, his eyes on the newspaper spread before him. Beside him, Deputy Jim Tolliver was working through a stack of pancakes, his uniform crisp despite the early hour. In the corner booth, old Walt Grissom and his chess partner, Pete Navarro, had their board set up between the salt and pepper shakers, locked in the same game they'd been playing for 3 weeks. Eleanor moved through the room with the grace of someone who belonged. She refilled Hank's coffee without him having to ask, dropped off extra syrup at Jim's table with a warm smile, paused by Walt and Pete's booth long enough to ask who was winning. "He is," Walt grumbled, nodding at Pete. "Cheater." "I'm not cheating. You're just losing." Pete shot back, grinning. Eleanor laughed, a soft sound that made both old men smile despite their fake bickering, and moved on. It was 6:45 when the bell above the door chimed again. Eleanor looked up from the order pad in her hand, and her entire world stopped. Standing in the doorway was her son. Ethan Hayes was not a large man in the way that demanded attention through sheer size. He was 6'1", lean and compact, with the kind of build that spoke of functional strength rather than vanity. Broad shoulders, tapered waist, arms that looked like they were carved from stone beneath the faded green canvas jacket he wore. His hair was dark brown, cut military short, and his face was all hard angles. Sharp jawline, straight nose, eyes the color of steel that seemed to see everything and give away nothing. He moved into the diner with the quiet, economical grace of a predator. No wasted motion, no unnecessary sound. He didn't announce himself, didn't wave, didn't call out. He just walked to the corner booth, the one furthest from the door with a clear line of sight to every entrance and exit, and slid into the seat facing the room. And at his side, moving in perfect silent synchronization, was the dog. The German Shepherd was magnificent. 90 pounds of pure muscle and controlled power. His coat was thick, a deep sable black that darkened to true black along his back and shoulders. His ears stood erect, constantly swiveling, processing every sound in the room. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and utterly focused. This was not a pet. This was not someone's friendly companion. This was a weapon. A living, breathing instrument of violence wrapped in fur. The dog wore a simple black tactical harness across his chest. No tags, no identification, just reinforced nylon and metal D-rings. He moved with a limp that was barely perceptible, favoring his left rear leg just slightly. But it didn't slow him down. If anything, it made him seem more dangerous. Like a scarred veteran who'd earned every mark. His name was Ranger, and he had served in more combat zones than most soldiers would see in a lifetime. Ethan didn't sit immediately. He paused, his hand resting lightly on Ranger's head, his eyes scanning the diner in a pattern so ingrained it was unconscious. Threat assessment, exit routes, potential hostiles, clear fields of fire. It took him less than 3 seconds, and then he nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his chin, and slid into the booth. Ranger moved with him, settling on the floor at his feet, his body positioned between Ethan and the door, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes still open, still watching. Eleanor stood frozen by Walt and Pete's table, the coffee pot in her hand trembling slightly. She hadn't known he was coming. He never told her when he was coming. Operational security, he'd said once, years ago, when she'd asked why he couldn't just give her a heads up. The less you know, Mum, the safer you are. But he was here now. Her boy. Her Ethan. She set the coffee pot down on the nearest table, ignoring Walt's half-formed question, and crossed the diner in quick, small steps. She didn't run. Eleanor Hayes didn't run, but she moved with purpose, her hands already reaching out before she'd even made it to his booth. "Ethan," she breathed, and her voice cracked on the single word. He stood immediately, unfolding from the booth with that same economical grace, and caught her in his arms. He was careful, always careful. His mother was small, fragile in a way that made his chest ache, and he held her like she was made of glass. But she wasn't fragile. Not really. Eleanor Hayes had buried a husband, had raised a son who'd gone off to fight wars she couldn't understand, had lived alone for years without complaint. She was stronger than anyone gave her credit for. "Hi, Mum," he said, his voice low and rough, the kind of voice that didn't get used much for casual conversation. She pulled back, her hands on his arms, her eyes scanning his face like she was checking for injuries. "You didn't call. You didn't tell me you were coming." "I know, I'm sorry. It was last minute." She wanted to scold him, wanted to tell him that a mother deserves notice, deserves time to prepare, to cook something special, to clean the house. But she didn't, because she knew better. She knew that when Ethan showed up without warning, it meant he'd had a window. A brief, precious gap in whatever shadowy work he did for the government. And she wasn't about to waste that window with complaints. "How long?" she asked instead. 3 days. 3 days. It was more than she usually got. She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. "Then you're staying with me? No arguments?" "Yes, ma'am." She looked down at Ranger, who had risen to a sitting position, his eyes fixed on her with that same unsettling intelligence. "And who is this handsome boy?" "This is Ranger," Ethan said, and there was something in his voice when he said the dog's name. Pride, respect, the kind of tone you'd use for a fellow soldier. "He's my partner." Eleanor knelt, slowly, her knees protesting the motion, and extended her hand. Ranger's nose twitched, sampling her scent, processing the data. Then, almost imperceptibly, his tail gave a single thump against the floor. Permission granted. She scratched behind his ears, and the big dog leaned into the touch, his eyes half closing. "You take care of my boy?" she asked softly. Ranger's tail thumped again. "Good," she whispered. "Then you and I are going to get along just fine." Ethan watched the interaction, and something in his chest loosened. Something he hadn't even realized was tight. Ranger didn't warm to people easily, didn't trust. But his mother had always had that gift. The ability to see past the armor, past the walls, and find the soul underneath. Eleanor stood, brushing off her apron. "You sit, both of you. I'm getting you breakfast." "Mom, you don't have to—" "Hush." She pointed at the booth. "Sit." He sat. She disappeared into the kitchen, and Ethan could hear her voice, animated and happy, telling Maggie that her son was here, that she needed the special, the good bacon, the fresh eggs, everything perfect. Ethan leaned back in the booth, his hand dropping to rest on Ranger's head. The dog's ears swiveled toward him, acknowledging the touch, and then returned to their surveillance of the room. They'd been together for 4 years. Ranger had been assigned to Ethan's unit during a deployment in Syria. The dog had been trained at Lackland Air Force Base, one of the elite few selected for special operations work. Explosive detection, enemy tracking, apprehension. He could find an IED buried 3 feet underground, could track a target through a crowded marketplace using scent alone, could take down a grown man in full body armor without hesitation. But more than that, Ranger understood. He understood the silence, the vigilance, the weight of the things they'd both seen and done. He didn't judge, didn't ask questions. He just existed, a constant, loyal presence in a world that was constantly shifting and hostile. Ethan trusted Ranger with his life, had done so a dozen times over. And now, sitting in this small-town diner, watching his mother laugh with Maggie in the kitchen, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. It wouldn't last. It never did. But for now, for this brief moment, he let himself have it. Ranger's head lifted slightly, his ears pricking forward. Ethan's hand stilled on the dog's fur. He didn't move, didn't tense, but his awareness shifted, sharpening. Ranger had heard something. Something was coming. The sound came first. A low, rumbling growl that wasn't animal. It was mechanical. The deep-throated roar of motorcycles, multiple engines, big ones, the kind that announced their presence like a declaration of war. The sound grew louder, closer, until it filled the street outside, and then cut off abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt wrong, threatening. Ranger's ears were fully erect now, his body shifting from relaxed to alert in the span of a heartbeat. His eyes fixed on the diner's front door. Ethan's hand remained on the dog's head. Steady, a silent command. Not yet. Wait. Inside the diner, conversations faltered. Hank looked up from his newspaper. Deputy Jim Tolliver's hand instinctively moved toward his hip, toward the service weapon he wore even during breakfast. Walt and Pete's chess game froze mid-move. Everyone in the Cornerstone Diner knew that sound, and everyone knew what it meant. Maggie emerged from the kitchen, a plate of eggs and bacon in each hand, her face tight with concern. She set the plates down in front of Ethan without a word, her eyes moving to the window. Eleanor followed behind her, carrying a bowl of grits and a basket of fresh biscuits, but she stopped when she saw the expressions on everyone's faces. "What is it?" she asked quietly. "The iron jackals." Hank muttered, his weathered face creasing into deep lines of disgust. "They're back." Eleanor's face went pale. She'd heard about them. Everyone in Coldwater had. They'd rolled into town 3 months ago, a motorcycle club from somewhere out of state, maybe Nevada, maybe California. Nobody knew for sure, and nobody had the courage to ask. They wore black leather vests with a snarling jackal head patch on the back. They moved in a pack, and wherever they went, trouble followed. They'd taken over the old bar on the edge of town, the one that used to be called Murphy's, but now had a hand-painted sign that just said, "Jackals." They drank, they fought, they intimidated. The local sheriff, an older man named Tom Briggs, who was 2 years from retirement, had tried to run them off. He'd walked into their bar with his deputy and politely but firmly told them they weren't welcome. They'd laughed in his face, and when Sheriff Briggs had reached for his radio to call for backup, one of them, a man with a shaved head and a neck tattoo of barbed wire, had grabbed his wrist and squeezed until something popped. The sheriff left the bar with a fractured wrist and his tail between his legs. He hadn't gone back. Since then, the jackals did whatever they wanted. They ran protection rackets on the local businesses, showed up demanding free meals, free drinks, free anything they could take. Most people paid. It was easier than fighting, safer than resisting. The front door of the diner swung open, the cheerful chime of the bell a grotesque contrast to the menace that walked through it. There were 5 of them, 5 men who looked like they'd been assembled from spare parts of nightmares and bad decisions. They were big, most of them over 6 feet, their bodies thick with muscle that had gone soft in places from too much beer and too little discipline. They wore their leather vests like armor, the jackal emblem on their backs a warning label. Their faces were hard, scarred, the kind of faces that had seen violence and decided they liked it. But it was the man in front who commanded attention. He was the biggest, maybe 6'4", with shoulders that seemed too wide for the door frame. His head was shaved smooth, his scalp reflecting the fluorescent lights. His face was a brutal landscape of broken nose, thick brow, and a jaw that looked like it had been chiseled from granite and then beaten with a hammer until it was ugly. A thick black beard covered the lower half of his face, braided in 2 long forks that hung down to his chest. His eyes were the worst part. Small, dark, dead. The kind of eyes that had seen pain and felt nothing. The kind of eyes that enjoyed causing it. His name was Axel Crane, and he was the president of the Iron Jackals. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting his presence fill the room, letting everyone feel the weight of it. Then he smiled, a slow, predatory expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Morning, folks." he said, his voice a deep rumble that matched his sighs. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Nobody answered. The diner had gone completely silent except for the soft hiss of the grill in the kitchen. Even that seemed to quiet, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Axel's gaze swept the room, cataloguing faces, noting fear, feeding on it. His eyes passed over Hank, over Deputy Tolliver, over Walt and Pete. Then they landed on Eleanor, who stood frozen near the kitchen door, the basket of biscuits still in her hands. His smile widened. "Well, well," he said, taking a step forward. His boots were heavy, steel-toed, and they made a deliberate thud with each step. "If it isn't Miss Eleanor, my favorite waitress." Eleanor's hands tightened on the basket. "We're not looking for trouble, Mr. Crane." "Mr. Crane." He laughed, a harsh bark of sound. So polite, so respectful. He looked back at his crew, who had fanned out behind him, blocking the exit. "You hear that, boys? She called me Mister." They laughed on cue, a chorus of ugly, mocking sounds. Axel turned back to Eleanor, his expression hardening. "Here's the thing, Miss Eleanor. I don't like being polite. I don't like being respectful. I like being paid." He held out one massive hand, palm up. "So let's skip the pleasantries. You know why I'm here. Maggie knows why I'm here. This diner owes us. Protection fee. Due yesterday." Maggie emerged from the kitchen, her face set in hard lines. "I paid you last month, Axel. $500. That was the agreement." "Agreements change," Axel said with a shrug. "Inflation, you know. Cost of doing business goes up. Our fee went up. It's $1,000 now." "1,000?" Maggie's voice rose. "That's robbery." "That's business." Axel's voice dropped, losing all pretense of humor. "And you're going to pay it, right now, or me and the boys are going to have a conversation with the health inspector about all the code violations we noticed. Faulty wiring, rodent infestation, unsafe food storage." He leaned forward, his face inches from Maggie's. "Be a real shame if this place got shut down." Deputy Tolliver stood up from his booth, his hand moving to his weapon. "That's enough, Crane. You need to leave." Axel turned slowly, his dead eyes fixing on the young deputy. "Or what, Junior? You're going to arrest me? You and what army?" He took a step toward Tolliver. "Your boss already learned what happens when he tries to play hero. You want a matching set of broken bones?" Tolliver's hand trembled on his weapon, but he didn't draw it. He was young, maybe 26, and he'd never actually pulled his gun on anyone. The fear in his eyes was obvious. Axel saw it and smiled. "That's what I thought." He dismissed the deputy with a wave and turned back to Maggie. "Now, the money." Eleanor stepped forward, her small frame somehow finding courage in the face of this monster. "Maggie doesn't have that kind of cash here. You know that. The bank doesn't even open for another hour." Axel's attention snapped to her like a predator locking on to movement. "Well then, Grandma, maybe you should mind your own business." "This is my business," Eleanor said quietly. "This is my diner. These are my people. And you don't get to come in here and threaten them." The room seemed to freeze. Even Axel's crew looked surprised. Nobody talked to Axel like that. Nobody. Axel's face darkened, the veins in his thick neck beginning to bulge. He took a step toward Eleanor, towering over her, using his size as a weapon. "You got a real smart mouth, old woman, real smart. You know what happens to people with smart mouths?" Eleanor didn't back down, didn't flinch. She looked up at him with those faded denim eyes, and there was no fear in them. Only defiance. "I know what happens to bullies who pick on people smaller than them. Eventually, they meet someone who isn't afraid. Axel stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed, but there was no humor in it, only rage. "You got spine, I'll give you that." He reached out with one massive hand and grabbed the front of her apron, yanking her forward so she stumbled into him. "But spine don't mean shit when you're old and weak and—" He never finished the sentence. Because Eleanor, in a move born of pure instinct and fear for what he might do next, brought the basket of biscuits up and shoved it into his face. Hot biscuits and the metal basket caught him square in the nose. It wasn't a powerful blow. She didn't have the strength for that. But it was unexpected, and it enraged him. Axel roared, shoving her backward. Eleanor stumbled, her foot catching on the edge of a chair. She fell hard, her hip hitting the checkered floor with a sickening crack. The basket clattered away, biscuits scattering like dice. And then, before anyone could process what had just happened, before anyone could move, Axel Crane took 2 steps forward and backhanded Eleanor Hayes across the face. The sound of it echoed through the diner like a gunshot. Sharp, violent, final. Eleanor's head snapped to the side, her body going limp, and she collapsed fully onto the floor. A thin line of blood appeared at the corner of her mouth. She didn't move. The diner exploded into chaos. Maggie screamed. Hank shot to his feet, his chair falling backward. Deputy Tolliver finally drew his weapon, his hands shaking so badly he could barely keep it level. Walt and Pete were on their feet, old men with fury in their eyes but no way to channel it. Axel stood over Eleanor's motionless form, breathing hard, his chest heaving. He looked at his hand, at the blood on his knuckles, and then he smiled. That same dead, empty smile. "Anybody else got something smart to say?" He asked the room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The fear was absolute. Except for one sound. From the corner booth, the one furthest from the door, came a low, deep growl. Not mechanical this time. Animal, primal. Ranger was on his feet, his lips pulled back from his teeth, his hackles raised along his entire spine. The growl that came from his chest was the sound of barely restrained violence. It was a warning. A promise. Axel turned toward the sound, his brow furrowing. "The hell?" And then Ethan Hayes stood up. He didn't stand quickly, didn't rush. He unfolded from the booth with slow, deliberate precision, rising to his full height. His face was completely calm. No expression, no anger, no fear. Nothing. His steel-grey eyes locked onto Axel Crane, and in them was something that made the bigger man take an involuntary step backward. It was the look of a man who had killed before. Many times. And would do so again without hesitation. Ethan took one step forward, then another. His boots made no sound on the floor. Ranger moved with him, perfectly synchronized, a shadow made of teeth and fury. "You just made a mistake," Ethan said, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. But it carried. Every person in that diner heard it. "You put your hands on my mother." Axel's crew moved forward, hands reaching for knives, for chains, for weapons. But Axel held up one hand, stopping them. He was staring at Ethan now, really seeing him for the first time, seeing the way he moved, the way he held himself, the absolute absence of fear. "Who the hell are you?" Axel demanded. Ethan stopped about 10 feet away. Ranger stood at his left side, coiled, ready, waiting for a single word. "I'm the son," Ethan said simply. "And you're about to learn what happens when you touch my family." The air in the Cornerstone diner changed. It went from thick with fear to electric with anticipation. Everyone could feel it. The shift. The moment when prey became predator. When the hunted became the hunter. Axel Crane was a big man. He'd built his reputation on violence. He'd broken bones, put men in hospitals, made grown men cry. He'd never backed down from a fight in his entire life. And he wasn't about to start now, especially not in front of his crew, especially not because of some nobody in a canvas jacket. "You threatening me?" Axel asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. He cracked his knuckles, the sound like snapping wood. "You got any idea who you're talking to?" Ethan's expression didn't change. "I know exactly who I'm talking to. A bully who hits 76-year-old women. That tells me everything I need to know." Axel's face flushed dark red. "You got a death wish, boy?" "No," Ethan said quietly. "But you might." That was it. The line crossed. The point of no return. Axel moved first. For a man his size, he was surprisingly fast. He closed the distance in 3 long strides, his right hand balling into a fist the size of a small ham. He swung, a haymaker aimed at Ethan's head with enough force behind it to break a jaw, maybe crack a skull. It never landed. Ethan moved, not away, into it. He stepped inside Axel's reach, his left hand coming up to redirect the punch past his head, his right hand driving forward in a short, devastating palm strike directly into Axel's solar plexus. The impact was precise. Surgical. It expelled every ounce of air from Axel's lungs in a single explosive gasp. Axel staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, trying desperately to breathe. Before he could recover, Ethan was on him. A low kick swept Axel's left leg out from under him. The big man went down hard, his knee cracking against the checkerboard floor, and in that same fluid motion, Ethan's elbow came down like a hammer against the nerve cluster at the base of Axel's neck. Axel's body went rigid, then collapsed forward onto his hands, his vision swimming, stars exploding behind his eyes. The whole exchange had taken less than 3 seconds. The Iron Jackals stared in stunned disbelief for exactly 1 heartbeat. Then they moved. The first one, a thick-bodied man with a shaved head and a scar running down his left cheek, pulled a hunting knife from his belt and lunged at Ethan from the side. He was fast, experienced, dangerous. But Ranger was faster. The German shepherd launched himself across the space between them like a black and tan missile. 90 pounds of trained violence moving at full speed. He hit the man mid-lunge, his jaws clamping down on the forearm holding the knife. The man screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure terror and pain as Ranger's bite force, over 300 pounds per square inch, crushed down on muscle and tendon. The knife clattered to the floor. Ranger didn't release. He twisted his head sharply, using his entire body weight as leverage, and drove the man to the ground. Then, with the precision of countless hours of training, he released the arm and repositioned, his jaws now inches from the man's throat, his body pinning him to the floor. A low, continuous growl vibrated from his chest. The message was clear. Move and die. The man didn't move. He lay there, whimpering, tears streaming down his face, staring into the dark, intelligent eyes of a predator who had decided, for now, to let him live. 2 more jackals came at Ethan simultaneously, 1 from each side. They'd learned from watching their friend. No weapons, just fists and numbers. The one on the left threw a wild punch. Ethan ducked under it, stepped into the man's space, and drove his knee up into the man's liver. It was a fight-ending blow. The liver shot dropped the jackal like a puppet with cut strings, his body folding in on itself, his face going grey as his nervous system overloaded with pain. He hit the floor and stayed there, curled into a fetal position, gasping. The one on the right managed to land a glancing blow to Ethan's shoulder. It was solid. Would have hurt a normal person. But Ethan had been hit by insurgents hopped up on adrenaline and cart. He'd been hit by enemy combatants trying to kill him. This punch was an inconvenience. He turned into it, absorbed the impact, and retaliated with a brutal efficiency that spoke of years of close-quarters combat training. A sharp elbow strike to the temple stunned the man. A sweep took his legs. And before he hit the ground, Ethan had his arm, hyperextending the elbow joint, applying pressure to the shoulder socket. The jackal screamed, tapping frantically against the floor in surrender. Ethan released him and stepped back. The man scrambled away, cradling his arm, his face white with pain and fear. That left two. They stood near the door, frozen, their eyes darting between their incapacitated friends, the dog holding one of them hostage, and Ethan, who stood in the center of the diner, breathing calmly, not even winded. "You can leave," Ethan said to them, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Or you can join them on the floor. Your choice. You've got 3 seconds." They chose to leave. They bolted through the door like scalded cats, the sound of their boots pounding against the pavement outside, followed by the roar of motorcycles starting and then fading into the distance. Ethan turned his attention back to Axel, who had managed to get to his knees, still gasping for air, his hand pressed against his throat where the nerve strike had landed. His eyes were no longer dead. They were filled with something new, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Fear. Ethan walked over to him slowly. Ranger, sensing the shift, released the man he'd been pinning and trotted back to Ethan's side, taking up his position. The jackal he'd been holding scrambled away, grabbing his friend with the destroyed liver, and the two of them half crawled, half stumbled out the door. Now it was just Ethan and Axel. Ethan crouched down, bringing himself to eye level with the broken biker. "You hit my mother," he said quietly. "You made her bleed. And for that I should put you in the ground right here, right now." Axel tried to speak, but his throat wasn't working right. He managed a raspy, Who are you?" "I'm someone you should have asked about before you walked through that door," Ethan replied. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a simple black wallet. He flipped it open. Inside was a military ID. No rank, no unit designation. Just a name and a series of security clearance codes that meant nothing to Axel, but should have terrified him if he'd known what they represented. "I'm Delta Force," Ethan said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I've spent the last 15 years in places you've never heard of, doing things you can't imagine, fighting people who make you look like a playground bully. And the only reason you're still breathing right now is because my mother wouldn't want me to kill you in her diner." He stood up, towering over Axel now. "But here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave Coldwater, you and your entire crew. You're going to pack up whatever garbage you've accumulated, and you're going to ride out of this town today, and you're never coming back." Axel found his voice, a weak rasp. You can't make me." "Yes," Ethan said simply. "I can, because if you don't, I'm going to make a phone call. One phone call. And by tomorrow morning, every federal agency with an acronym is going to be crawling through your life. DEA, ATF, FBI. They're going to audit your club. They're going to find every illegal weapon, every bag of meth, every stolen bike part, every parole violation. They're going to tear your entire organization apart, brick by brick. He leaned down, his face inches from Axel's. And then, after they've arrested everyone you know, after they've seized everything you own, I'm going to come find you personally. And we're going to have a private conversation about what happens to men who hit defenseless old women. The threat hung in the air, and Axel Crane, the man who'd terrorized an entire town, who'd built his reputation on fear and violence, believed every word, because he was looking into the eyes of a man who'd killed for his country, who'd done it without hesitation and would do it again. Understand? Ethan asked. Axel nodded, a jerky, desperate motion. Say it. I understand. Axel wheezed. We'll leave. Today, I swear. Good. Ethan stood up and stepped back. Now get out of my sight. Axel scrambled to his feet, his movements clumsy, all his earlier confidence and menace stripped away. He looked like what he truly was under all the leather and tattoos and attitude. A coward. He limped toward the door, not looking back, not saying another word. The bell chimed as he left, that same cheerful sound, now a benediction marking his exit. The diner was silent. Everyone stared at Ethan, at Ranger, processing what they'd just witnessed. Deputy Jim Tolliver was the first to speak, his voice shaking slightly. I've never seen anything like that. Ethan ignored him. He turned and walked quickly to where his mother lay on the floor. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands gentle as he cradled her head. Mum? Mum, can you hear me? Eleanor's eyes fluttered open. She looked up at her son, confused, her hand going to her face where Axel had struck her. Ethan, what happened? It's over, he said softly. You're safe. He's gone. Maggie rushed over with a wet cloth and a first aid kit. Together, she and Ethan helped Eleanor sit up, leaning her against the side of a booth. The cut at the corner of her mouth was shallow, already clotting, but a dark bruise was forming along her cheekbone. I'm okay, Eleanor insisted, though her voice was weak. I'm okay, honey. Don't fuss. But Ethan was fussing. He was checking her pupils, checking her pulse, his training taking over. Ranger pressed his nose against Eleanor's hand, a gentle nudge, and she smiled weakly, scratching behind his ears. You're a good boy, she whispered to the dog. Such a good boy. The front door opened again, and everyone tensed. But it was Sheriff Tom Briggs, his face pale, his injured wrist still in a brace. He'd heard the commotion, had been parked down the street working up the courage to intervene, and had seen Axel and his crew fleeing town like demons were chasing them. He stood in the doorway, taking in the scene. The overturned chairs, the scattered biscuits, Eleanor on the floor with blood on her face, and Ethan, this stranger, kneeling beside her with a combat-trained dog at his side. Someone want to tell me what the hell just happened here? Sheriff Briggs asked. Deputy Tolliver stepped forward, his voice steadier now. Justice happened, sir. Finally. Ethan looked up at the sheriff, his expression neutral. Axel Crane assaulted my mother. I defended her. He and his club have agreed to leave Coldwater. Permanently. You won't have any more problems with them. Sheriff Briggs stared at him for a long moment. He should have been angry, should have asserted his authority, but he'd lived with the shame of being unable to protect his town for 3 months. And now this stranger had done in 5 minutes what he couldn't do with a badge and a gun. You military? Briggs asked quietly. Yes, sir. Briggs nodded slowly. Then he did something unexpected. He extended his good hand. Then thank you, for doing what I couldn't. Ethan shook his hand, a brief, firm grip. The sheriff looked around the diner. Anyone here want to press charges against Mr. Crane for assault, extortion, or any of the other dozen crimes he's committed? Now's your chance. Maggie stepped forward. I do. I'll testify. I'll give you everything. One by one, the other patrons nodded. Hank, Walt, Pete, even Deputy Tolliver, his face set with new determination. Then let's make sure those bastards never come back, Sheriff Briggs said, pulling out his radio. I'm calling the state police. It's time we cleaned house. As the sheriff stepped outside to make his calls, Eleanor reached up and touched her son's face. You didn't have to do that, she said softly. Yes, Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion. I did. She smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. Your father would have been proud. And Ethan, the Delta Force operator who'd faced down terrorists and warlords without flinching, felt his own eyes burn. By mid-afternoon, the Cornerstone Diner had returned to something resembling normalcy, though the tension still lingered like smoke after a fire. Eleanor was resting in the back office, an ice pack pressed to her cheek, refusing to go home despite Ethan's protests. Maggie had reopened the diner, and the locals trickled back in, their conversations hushed but animated, retelling the morning's events with the enthusiasm of people who'd witnessed something legendary. Sheriff Briggs sat in the corner booth across from Ethan, a cup of coffee cooling between his hands. His face was grave. The state police had come and gone, taking statements, photographing the scene, putting out an APB for Axel Crane and the Iron Jackals. But something was bothering the sheriff, something he couldn't quite put into words. They'll scatter, Briggs said finally, staring into his coffee. Axel and his crew, they'll run to Nevada, maybe Oregon, change their patches, start over somewhere else. He looked up at Ethan. But here's what doesn't make sense to me. The Jackals have been here 3 months. 3 months of running protection rackets, extortion, intimidation. But they never actually took anything big. Never robbed the bank, never hit the jewelry store, never stole from the wealthy folks up on the ridge. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. What are you saying? I'm saying they were focused on small businesses, the diner, the hardware store, the auto shop, places that deal in cash, places that don't ask questions. Briggs tapped his finger on the table. And about once a week, late at night, I'd see their trucks heading north on Route 12, always around 2, 3 in the morning. Heavy trucks, not bikes. Trucks. Where does Route 12 go? Ethan asked. Up into the mountains, old logging roads, abandoned mining country. Nothing up there anymore except wilderness and... Briggs paused, his face darkening. And the old Kellerman property? Deputy Tolliver, who'd been listening from the counter, turned around. The Kellerman place? That old ranch? Not a ranch anymore, Briggs said. Marcus Kellerman died 8 years ago. His son Vincent inherited it. 500 acres of isolated mountain land. Vincent's a businessman, real estate developer. Made a fortune buying up foreclosed properties during the recession, flipping them. He's been trying to turn Coldwater into some kind of resort town. Wants to build condos, upscale shops, turn us into the next Aspen. Ethan's jaw tightened. And the town's been resisting. Damn right we have, Briggs said with conviction. This is our home. We don't want his glass towers and his tourist traps. The town council voted against his development proposal 3 times. That was about 4 months ago. He looked at Ethan meaningfully. Right before the iron jackals showed up. The pieces began to click together in Ethan's mind. He hired them. Can't prove it, Briggs admitted. But yeah, I think Vincent Kellerman brought in the jackals to terrorize the town, to break our spirit, to make us so desperate we'd welcome his development just to feel safe again. He clenched his good hand into a fist. And it was working. Half the town council wanted to reverse the vote, wanted to let him build, anything to make the jackals go away. Ethan sat back, his mind already shifting into operational mode. This wasn't just about a biker gang anymore. It was about corruption. About a powerful man using fear and violence as tools to get what he wanted. The same pattern he'd seen in a dozen third-world countries. The same rot, just wearing a nicer suit. What's Kellerman's angle with the trucks? Ethan asked. If he's just trying to intimidate the town, why the late-night runs to his property? Briggs shook his head. That's what I can't figure. Could be they're storing weapons up there. Could be drugs. Could be nothing. Just them using his land as a base. He looked at Ethan, and there was a plea in his eyes. But I can't get a warrant. Vincent Kellerman has lawyers. Expensive ones. He's connected. He donates to the governor's campaign. And I'm just a small-town sheriff with no evidence and a broken wrist. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Ranger, who'd been resting at his feet, lifted his head, sensing the shift in his handler's energy. Ethan reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, his mind working through the problem like a tactical puzzle. I need to see that property, Ethan said finally. Briggs's eyes widened. Son, that's private land. You can't just, I'm not going to knock on the front door, Sheriff. Ethan interrupted, his voice calm but firm. I'm going to do what I do best, reconnaissance, tonight. Ranger and I will go in quiet, see what's there, and get out without anyone knowing we were there. That's illegal, Briggs said, though his tone suggested he wasn't exactly opposed to the idea. So is hiring a criminal gang to terrorize a town? Ethan countered. If Kellerman's clean, we'll know by sunrise. If he's dirty, we'll have evidence you can use to get a real warrant. Either way, we'll have answers. Deputy Tolliver stood up from the counter, his young face set with determination. I want to help. Ethan shook his head. No, you're law enforcement. You have rules, I don't. Not for this. Then what do you need from us? Briggs asked. Ethan pulled out a small notepad and began sketching. I need topographical maps of the area. Satellite imagery if you can get it. Property boundaries. Access roads. And I need you to tell me everything you know about Vincent Kellerman's schedule, his security, his personnel. For the next 2 hours, they planned. Briggs provided what information he had. Maggie, who'd been listening from behind the counter, contributed local knowledge about the old logging trails. Even Hank, the old-timer who'd lived in Coldwater his entire life, came over and marked hidden paths on the map, routes he'd used as a boy hunting deer in those mountains. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Ethan gathered his gear, his tactical pack. Night vision optics, a suppressed sidearm, Ranger's working harness. He wasn't going to war, but he was going into potentially hostile territory, and he'd learned long ago that preparation was the difference between coming home and not coming home. Eleanor emerged from the back office, her bruise now a deep purple but her eyes clear and determined. She watched her son check his equipment with the practiced efficiency of a professional warrior, and her heart ached with pride and fear in equal measure. "You're going after them," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to find out the truth," Ethan replied, not looking up from his pack. She walked over and placed a small hand on his arm. "Then you be careful, and you come back to me." He looked at her, his steel-grey eyes softening. "Always, Mom. Always!" As darkness fell over cold water, Ethan Hayes and Ranger disappeared into the mountains, two shadows moving through the wilderness with purpose. Somewhere up in those hills was the truth, and Ethan was going to find it. The night was cold and moonless, the kind of darkness that swallowed light and sound. Ethan moved through the forest like a ghost, his footsteps silent on the carpet of pine needles, his breathing controlled and rhythmic. Ranger was 10 feet ahead, nose to the ground, ears swiveling constantly, his black and tan coat making him nearly invisible in the shadows. They'd been moving uphill for 90 minutes, navigating the old logging trails that Hank had marked on the map, staying well clear of the main road. The Kellerman property sprawled across a high valley. Surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides and a sheer cliff face on the 4th. It was isolated, defensible, perfect for someone who didn't want visitors. As they crested the final ridge, Ethan dropped to a prone position and pulled out his night vision monocular. The world turned green and grainy, but suddenly alive with detail. Below, nestled in the valley, was a compound. Not a ranch. A compound. 3 large prefabricated buildings arranged in a U-shape around a central courtyard. Floodlights on motion sensors illuminated the perimeter. 2 guards, armed with rifles, patrolled in lazy circuits. And in the center of the courtyard sat 4 large shipping containers, the kind used for international freight. Ethan's jaw tightened. This wasn't storage. This was distribution. He pulled out a small camera and began documenting everything. Guard positions, camera placements, the license plates on the 2 pickup trucks parked near the largest building. Ranger pressed against his side, silent, sensing the need for absolute stillness. Then the door to the main building opened, and a man stepped out. Even at this distance, even through the green haze of night vision, Ethan recognized him from the photos Sheriff Briggs had shown him. Vincent Kellerman. Tall, lean, maybe 50 years old, wearing expensive outdoor gear that had probably never seen actual outdoor work. He was on his phone, gesturing animatedly, clearly agitated. Ethan couldn't hear the conversation, but he didn't need to, because a moment later another figure emerged from the building, and this one made everything clear. It was one of the Iron Jackals, not Axel, but one of the others. The one with the barbed wire neck tattoo who'd been at the diner that morning. He was here, at Kellerman's compound. The connection wasn't theoretical anymore, it was confirmed. Ethan was about to pull back, to extract with the evidence, when Ranger's body went rigid. His ears flattened, and a barely audible growl rumbled in his chest. Someone was coming. Behind them. Ethan rolled silently to his left, into the deeper shadows beneath a fallen pine, his hand moving to his weapon. Ranger melted into the darkness beside him, completely invisible. 2 men appeared on the trail below their position. More jackals patrolling the perimeter. They were talking, their voices carrying in the still night air. "Can't believe Axel ran," one of them was saying. "Vincent's pissed, says we're supposed to stay. Finish the job." "Finish what job?" the other replied. "That guy at the diner destroyed 5 of us in like 10 seconds. You want to go back there and face him again?" "Hell no. But Vincent's saying if we don't keep pressure on the town, the whole plan falls apart. He needs them desperate enough to approve the development, and without Axel running the show. Their voices faded as they moved past, completely oblivious to the predator watching them from above. Ethan waited 5 full minutes after they disappeared before moving. He'd heard enough. Kellerman wasn't just connected to the jackals. He was running them. And the shipping containers, the compound, the security, all of it pointed to something bigger than just intimidation. This was trafficking, drugs, weapons, maybe both. He needed to get closer. Moving with surgical precision, Ethan and Ranger descended the ridge using a narrow game trail. They skirted the compound's eastern edge, staying in the dead zones between camera coverage. Ranger's nose worked constantly, alerting Ethan to the presence of guards before they came into view, giving them time to freeze, to wait, to move only when it was safe. They reached the back of one of the shipping containers. Ethan pulled out a small fiber optic camera, no bigger than a pencil, and slid it through a gap in the container's door seal. The tiny screen showed him what was inside, and his blood ran cold. Crates, dozens of them, stenciled with military markings, weapons, not hunting rifles, not civilian firearms. These were military-grade assault rifles, still packed in factory grease. And beside them, wrapped in plastic, were bricks of something white. Cocaine or fentanyl, maybe both. This wasn't just local corruption. This was federal. This was the kind of operation that would bring DEA, ATF, and FBI down on cold water like a hammer. Ethan photographed everything, his camera's shutter silent, the flash disabled. He was building a case, evidence that would be irrefutable. But he needed one more thing. He needed Kellerman on record. That's when he saw it. Through a window of the main building, illuminated by the glow of computer monitors, was an office. And in that office, Vincent Kellerman was sitting at a desk, still on his phone, still agitated. The window was cracked open, just slightly, probably for ventilation. Ethan pulled out a small, parabolic microphone, a piece of equipment designed to capture conversations from a distance. He aimed it at the window, put in his earpiece, and listened. "Don't care if Axel ran," Kellerman was saying, his voice tinny but clear. "You get the rest of the crew back here. We have a shipment arriving in 48 hours. I need those containers moved through cold water before the state police start sniffing around." A pause. "No, we're not shutting down. We're too close. Once the town approves my development, we'll have legitimate cover for the trucks. We'll be untouchable." Ethan's recording device captured every word. "And if anyone else tries to play hero like that guy at the diner," Kellerman continued, his voice turning cold, "you make an example of them. I don't care if it's the sheriff, the mayor, or that old woman. Fear is our asset. Use it." That was enough. More than enough. Ethan clicked off the microphone and began his extraction. He and Ranger moved back through the shadows, retracing their steps, avoiding the patrol routes they'd memorized. They were a quarter mile from the compound when the alarms went off. Floodlights erupted across the valley. Sirens wailed. Ethan cursed under his breath. They'd been spotted, probably by a camera he'd missed, or a motion sensor on the perimeter he hadn't accounted for. It didn't matter. What mattered was getting out. "Ranger, move!" he commanded, and the dog took off at a dead run, his injured leg forgotten in the surge of adrenaline. Ethan followed, his lungs burning as they sprinted up the steep hillside. Behind them, he could hear engines roaring to life, shouts, the metallic clack of weapons being readied. They reached the ridge and kept going, plunging into the dense forest on the far side. Ranger led the way. his nose finding the path even in total darkness. Ethan could hear the trucks behind them, crashing through the underbrush, but they were in vehicles, limited to roads and trails. Ethan and Ranger were on foot, able to go anywhere. They ran for 30 minutes, putting miles between themselves and the compound, before Ethan finally slowed. They were deep in the wilderness now, far from any road. Safe. He pulled out his sat phone and dialed Sheriff Briggs. "I've got everything," Ethan said when the sheriff answered. "Photos, audio. Kellerman's on tape admitting to trafficking and conspiracy. You've got your warrant. You've got your case." By dawn, the Kellerman compound was surrounded. Not by local police, but by federal agents, DEA, ATF, FBI. They'd moved fast, coordinating with Sheriff Briggs, using Ethan's evidence to secure emergency warrants. Vincent Kellerman was arrested without incident, his expensive lawyers powerless in the face of recorded confessions and photographic evidence of federal crimes. The remaining Iron Jackals scattered, most of them picked up within 48 hours on outstanding warrants. Axel Crane was found 3 states away, arrested at a gas station, and extradited back to Montana to face charges of assault, extortion, and conspiracy. 2 weeks later, the Cornerstone Diner was packed, not with fear, but with celebration. The town council had held an emergency meeting and unanimously voted to award Eleanor Hayes and Maggie Delacroix commendations for their courage. Sheriff Briggs, his wrist now healed, stood at the front of the room and told the story of how a Delta Force operator and his K-9 had saved their town. But Ethan wasn't there to hear it. He was sitting on Eleanor's front porch, Ranger at his feet, watching the sun set over the mountains. His mother came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him in the rocking chair that had been his father's. "You leaving tomorrow?" she asked quietly. "Yeah," Ethan said. "Duty calls." She reached over and took his hand. "You know you gave this town something precious, don't you? You gave us back our courage. You reminded us that we don't have to live in fear." Ethan looked at his mother, at the fading bruise on her cheek, at the strength in her eyes. "You already had that, Mom. You just needed someone to show you." Ranger's tail thumped against the porch, and Eleanor laughed, reaching down to scratch his ears. "And what about you, brave boy? You taking care of my son?" The dog's tail thumped harder, and Ethan smiled. Always does. As the stars came out, one by one, lighting up the Montana sky, Eleanor leaned her head against her son's shoulder. Tomorrow he would leave, back to whatever shadows he lived in, back to whatever wars he fought. But tonight he was home, and that was enough. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to stand up anyway, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling us what moment moved you most. Was it Eleanor's defiance, Ethan's precision, Ranger's loyalty, or the town's refusal to surrender to fear? Subscribe to our channel for more stories that celebrate the quiet heroes among us. The warriors who protect those who cannot protect themselves, and the unbreakable bonds between mothers and sons, between soldiers and their faithful companions. And if you believe that good will always triumph over evil, that courage is contagious, and that one person with conviction can change everything, type Amen in the comments below. May you find the strength to be someone's hero. May you stand firm when others falter. And may you never forget that the greatest battles are fought not for glory, but for the people we love. Thank you for listening. Stay safe. Stay strong. And remember, evil only wins when good people do nothing.